welcome to Meeple University's How to Play Tiny Epic Galaxies. In Tiny Epic Galaxies, players attempt to earn victory points, indicated by the number in a swirling blue circle, by spreading their influence throughout the galaxy, either colonizing planets or increasing the quality of their empire. The game plays until the round in which one player reaches 21 points, and the player with the most points at the end of that round wins. The game plays 2 to 5 players, and there is also a solo mode which I won't go through during this video. To set up Tiny Epic Galaxies, each player takes a player board in his or her colour and uses the side which is entirely in the player colour. The other side with the red boxes is for the solo mode. Next, each player has 2 tokens representing resources: energy, which goes on the 2 space, and culture, which goes on the 1 space. This track around the board tracks how much of each of those resources a player has, and there is a maximum of 7 at any point in time. Next, the player takes the Empire Progress token and places it on the lowest space on the progress track. This will move up through the game. The statistics of an empire are shown by reading inwards towards the centre from that token. And so the player's starting statistics will be 2 spaceships, which are placed on the centre of the galaxy, and 4 dice, which will come when the player takes his or her turn. The player's remaining ships are placed on the square-edged spaces on this track, as these represent the point at which the player will gain them. The player's empire begins with no victory points, but improving the empire through the game will give a number of victory points according to the space on this track. Next, deal a number of planet cards from the planet deck into the central area of the table based on how many players are playing. It should be 2 more than the number of players, up to a maximum of 6 for a 5-player game. Each planet card has a lot of information on it, which I'll go into later as we go through the actions. Key thing to note, the number of victory points for colonizing that planet is shown in the bottom corner and ranges from 1 to 7. Finally, each player is dealt 2 cards from the secret mission deck. These are cards which, if completed, are worth 2 or 3 victory points at the end of the game. The player chooses one, discards the other, and keeps it hidden. Secret mission cards are not gained at any other time during the game. The actions in the game of Tiny Epic Galaxies are controlled by these 7 dice. All the dice are identical, and each side has an icon depicting one of the 6 actions in the game. To begin a player's turn, the player takes the number of dice as indicated on the current level of that player's empire on the player mat. Player rolls the dice. The lid of the box is provided as a dice tray. This depicts the actions that are available. To perform an action off one of the dice, take the die and place it into one of these spaces in the activation bay. The player who rolled the dice then performs the action depicted, in this case, move. After the player whose turn it is has performed any action with a die, all other players in the game have the opportunity to follow that action. In order to follow, the player must spend 1 culture and then performs the action on that die as if he or she had rolled it. The player does not have to follow, and the player may only follow each die once. For example, this player could not spend 3 culture to perform 3 move actions off that 1 die. The player could only perform it once. However, after a second move had been played, a second culture could be spent on that one in order to perform 2 following move actions on 1 turn. Players can usually perform their follows all at the same time in order to speed the game up, but in times where the order matters, normal turn order holds. At any point on a player's turn, if he or she is unhappy with the dice available, the player may re-roll them. Take any number of unwanted dice and re-roll them in the dice tray. The first time a player does this on his or her turn, it is free. For all subsequent occasions, the player must spend 1 energy. To clarify, 1 energy allows any number of dice to be re-rolled, not just 1. The other option available to a player if he or she does not like the dice that have been rolled is that any 2 unused dice can be placed into these spaces on the converter in order to turn the third die to any side of the player's choice. That die can then be placed down here and followed by other players as normal, but the dice that are placed into the converter cannot be followed by other players. This can only be done once per turn. Finally, if a player does not like the dice, he or she may choose not to activate the dice. Once the player has activated all dice that he or she wishes to activate during a turn, that player's turn is over and the dice are passed to the next player. Next, I'll go through the 6 actions in the game. The first action, represented by the rocket ship icon, is movement. To move, a player takes any one of his or her available ships, that is, those which are not still frozen on this track, and moves it to a different planet. The player can move from galaxy mat to the surface of any other planet, from galaxy mat to the orbit track of any other planet, from an orbit track to a surface, from a surface to an orbit track. Players can go on planets or orbit tracks with other players, and can go into the orbit track of a planet where that player's ship is. But the player cannot have 2 ships on the same planet, nor 2 ships in the same orbit track. A player also cannot use the movement action to move from the orbit track of one planet to its surface, or from the surface to its orbit track. When a player lands on the surface of a planet using the move action, the player may immediately take the action of that planet as depicted in the box at the bottom. When the player moves to the orbit track of a planet, the player lies the ship down in the first space of that track. The player does not take the action associated with the planet in this case. Note that the movement action does not allow players to move up the orbit track. That is done with these separate actions, which I'll come back to later. The next 2 actions are both for gaining resources, in this case energy, and in this case culture. To use the gain energy action, the player gains energy, moving the cube up the track, 1 space for every one of his or her ships, either on or in orbit around an energy planet. Note for these purposes that the player's galaxy mat, as in this space here, counts as an energy planet. So in this case, by taking this action, the player would gain 2 energy. Working in a similar way, taking the culture action allows a player to gain 1 culture for every ship on or in orbit around a culture planet. The next 2 actions allow players to move up the colonization tracks of planets, either by diplomacy or by economic development. Either of these actions allows a player to move 1 of his or her ships along a corresponding type of colonization track. So this action would allow yellow to move that ship 1 space along this track. This action would allow the player to move 1 of these 2 ships 1 space along that track. When a player reaches the icon space at the end of a colonization track, that player has successfully colonized the planet. All ships on that card, whether on the orbit track or on the surface, return to the player's home mats. And the player who colonized the planet takes the card and slips it under here on the player mat. This gives the player the number of victory points shown on that card, as well as giving them access to that action in a way that I'll describe shortly. The empty space on the board is replaced with the top card from the pack. The final action is to utilize a colony. Taking this action allows the player to perform any one of the actions shown down here. This will be the actions of any colonized planets, as well as a basic action which is available on all player mats. The standard action on each player's player mat is to upgrade his or her empire. That is, to move this marker up the track. In order to do this, look at where the marker is and look at the next space it's going to. This is the cost of the upgrade, and it may be paid in either energy or culture, but not a mix of both. So in this case, the cost would be 3. Player could spend 3 energy or 3 culture. If this takes the empire to a space where a new ship is available, that ship is immediately moved from the track and onto the galaxy, ready to be used later that turn. If the player's empire moves to a level where a new die is available, that is not rolled until the player's next turn. The other way to use the utilize a colony action is to perform the action of any one of the colonized planets. So this player could use any one of these to gain 2 energy, for example. At any given time, a player's number of victory points is equal to the sum of victory points on colonized planets and the number of victory points on the Empire track. Secret mission victory points, even if the mission is completed, are not counted until the end of the game, so that's not currently considered part of the player's score. So at this point in time, the player has 3 plus 2 plus 2 plus 7 is 14 victory points. Once a player reaches 21 visible victory points, this triggers the end of the game. Play continues around until all players have had an equal number of turns, and players may colonize additional planets up until the end of that time. Once the game is over, all players reveal and score their secret mission cards, adding the victory points to the total that's visible. After adding this, the player with the highest score wins. In the event of a tie, the tiebreakers, in order, are most colonized planets, highest level on the Empire track, and most combined remaining resources. If still tied, the victory is shared.